Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to be reviewing this sword right here. This is Luck, or Pluck, from Jojo's Bizarre Adventure. And this one was made by Mini.Katana. And before I get into the review, a couple quick disclaimers and caveats. One, I got this sword for free from Mini.Katana. It's a review sample. I didn't spend any money on it. If you think that makes me biased, you know at the start. Two, I often mention here how I don't know how to move this sword around. I don't study Hemo or, this, that, or the other kind of swordsmanship. But I don't know that anyone does. This is a fantasy-style sword. And do note, I acknowledge I'm being very pedantic about basically an adult toy, but not that kind of adult toy. But you get what I mean. This is not a historical sword. It's not intended to be, and some artistic license has to be taken in bringing a drawing into reality. So I'm acknowledging all that up front, but I'm still going to be very nitpicky about it. Just that's kind of my shtick here on YouTube. The other bit that you should probably note about the sword is that it's $219 on Mini.Katana's website right now, which is linked in the description down below if you're keen on getting one. So, last thing, disclaimer, I don't know anything about Jojo's Bizarre Adventure. I'm not the best person necessarily to be talking about this in terms of how close does it represent what's supposed to be in the anime. And I looked at it, and I think they, at least from a distance, did a reasonable job. I've seen the sword have a larger guard that sometimes encompasses or covers your hand. So, some artistic liberties have to be taken here, and in some cases it doesn't cover your hand. But some of the gripes that I'm going to have about the design choice, I don't know that I can fault Mini.Katana for it, because they have to take one drawing and bring it into reality, and there's a little bit of variation in the anime. So anyway, all of that acknowledged, I'm going to go on with the bits and bobs and fits and features. The intent behind this kind of video here, by the way, is to show you up close video, give you some idea build quality, hopefully give you some idea what you're buying and if it's worth your money or not. I'll talk about moving it, I'll talk about cutting with it, and you'll get to see what it takes to push it to failure as well. And so hopefully at the end of that, you're better informed on if it's worth your money or not. And that's anyway the goal here. So sword friends, last minute update. Mini.Katana put an update on their website that addressed one of the concerns, or several of the concerns, that I had around their ad copy. I note in this video where I think it's inaccurate, and I took that information, I sent it to Mini.Katana, and within 24 hours the website was updated. And I do want to give a special call out on how good that is. I think it's great that if you didn't know about an issue, you found out about it, you made corrections right away. That's really as much as I could hope for here. So you're going to continue to hear me complain about where I think their ad copy is inaccurate, but do know that it's been addressed, and I think the ad copy on the website accurately reflects the product. You'll see me complain about other aspects of the product, which are still very valid, I think, and so I'd continue to watch the video. I think there's still good bits in it, but do know when I bring up ad copy that needs to be changed, it has. And so tip of my hat to Mini.Katana there. On with the show. I'm going to go on with the pommel, the end cap, this bit right here. Now you notice that it's off, and this has a little fork on the end that more or less friction fits inside the end of this metal doowacky here. And this comes out reasonably easily, and while it's off, you have access to this nut part here, which you'll notice is also off. So this allows you to tighten the handle down or something like that if it develops any kind of rattle. And I would say that it doesn't come off or wiggle that easily. Now, when I went to go do some abusive stuff, more or less it came off. That's the elephant in the room. But while I was doing tatami mat cutting, bottle cutting, and the like, this stayed on here. Now, it's made of a type of metal that doesn't bend a whole lot, so I'm not sure if it does bend, how many kind of retightenings you're going to get, so to speak, given that it's friction fit. But I would say that in my usage, it didn't come off until I was doing some rather aggressive stuff, which you'll see later. The other bits to note is that in terms of how closely does it represent the anime, it looks pretty close. The dimensionality that I would expect to see in a historic example isn't necessarily present here, but I don't know that it's supposed to be. What I do see is reasonably well painted stuff. In the nooks and crannies here, where this little disc piece is welded to this cap bit, some of the powder coating or whatever adhesive paint or whatever kind of paint is on here has not gone into the little nooks and crannies here. And to this sword's credit, very few of these nooks and crannies are unpainted. It seems like they coated it relatively well, and if you look in all the little nooks and crannies, there are very few of them that are absent paint, and this happens to be one of them. But you do kind of have to look in the nook and cranny to find it. The little purple gem things have a very plastic feel. I don't know necessarily what they're supposed to feel like or be, but they stayed on there, and again, I was rather abusive with the sword. The pommel came off though, so there wasn't a lot of rattle going into the disc here, or a lot of reverberation. The pommel came off before it did that. The other bit that I would note is that the paint here, and this is going to be common throughout as I talk about the rest of the hilt, it chips a little bit. Now, it's not easy to chip, but it does chip, especially if you use it aggressively. And if you hit really hard things with it, these metal bits kind of touch each other, and it's prone to chipping in spots. At a distance, or at least when it came out of the box, it looked great, and there were no noticeable chips that I was able to spot out of the box. But after using it a little bit, after disassembling it and fumbling with it a little bit, some of those chips were present. Now, the other bit to note is that this handle right here, you can see that the next part I'm going to talk about is the handle here where it says Pluck. And the pommel component, as it leads up here, the transition overall, like the machining or casting or whatever they're doing here is reasonably well done. I don't notice like a whole bunch of seams, and apart from the absence of some paint, everything actually looked right and tight. But when I went to go do some abusive stuff, the corner of this handle component chipped, and that means that I can't put it back in. So when I went to go do abusive stuff, and where you draw the line at abusive is perhaps going to be different. The ad copy on Mini.Katana's website at the moment anyway says, like, you know, ready for any kind of battle. So chopping into a log in your backyard may not be abusive to you. I would say it is. This is not unexpected given that activity, but that's why I guess I'm doing it so you can see. But anyway, there was a chip that happened at the bottom here, which means that the pommel would not go in anymore. It wouldn't friction fit. The other bits to note about this kind of grip area here, it's kind of slippery, so not so bad when you're using it with a dry hand, but as your hands get wet, or if they're oily at all, the surface is relatively smooth, and not a whole lot other than just sheer strength really kind of keeps you bound to it. It moves around, and it can kind of twist in your hand a little bit. Now, that's the design of the sword. And I would say that they've preserved the look of the sword, but in terms of is it comfortable as a sword, no. I can index it, I do know where the edge is, but it doesn't lock into the hand particularly well. It's not particularly comfortable either. Now, the construction from Mini.Katana is, I guess, where I can take some issue here. So the bits chipping and whatnot when it comes to abuse, ideally it's a little bit more durable. The handle basically falling apart is a piece that is not ideal, and it looks like whatever this was cast out of just isn't sufficient to take the kinds of punishment that you might see if you are at least whacking into logs in the backyard. Now, while I did abusive things, conceivably if you're cutting with tatami mats, or if you're cutting bamboo, or you just have a really bad cut, some of these abusive things to me could happen in more normal usage to you, maybe accidental bad cuts, or kind of swing and a miss, if you will. And so I think the handle could be a little bit more robust. Now, to its credit, it really held together. It gave me plenty of sign that failure was incoming, but there's quite a bit to unpack under this handle. So in terms of failure, one, this nut was attached. Now, this was accessible at the bottom here. If I took the little pommel off, this nut was there, and I could get a wrench in there and tighten things down. So that's good. You know, if something loosens up, you have access to fix it easily. The downside is it's listed as a I believe is some sort of full tang or something like this. So having this nut on here isn't full tang. And so the ad copy on their website, I believe, should change, because as I'm looking at it, it says crafted with full tang construction and 1060 carbon steel. So this is not a full tang. This is not exactly a rat tail tang either. Now, the tang is, you know, if I go up to the other part of the tang, this part is quite thick, and then this little threaded bit was welded in here, and this provided some tension. And it's not a bad construction necessarily, but it's not really as robust as you might hope for a sword being sold as battle ready. So the tang, when I went to go bash on logs, this part failed and came off, and so more or less the only thing holding the sword in was this little brass peg here, which, to its credit, actually held up all the way through. The handle really disassembled itself before the tang came, before the sword came out. But The other bit to note is that this tang is quite a bit more robust, and so when I was whacking into things, the tang section here came loose and then just basically shattered and blew out this side of the handle. So not so comfortable to grip, and that's when really the testing was pretty much over, because I couldn't hold on to the thing without it whacking into my hand. But the rest of it kind of came undone. So the sword more or less was undone by the handle. The tang blowing out, being listed as full tang and having a threaded nut, a pretty long section of tang that isn't full, and then the pommel that more or less is going to come off. You know, on one hand it's nice, but if it's sold as like a battle ready thing, the friction fit here is insufficient to do battle. And just general handiness, I would say it's not a particularly comfortable handle, but to its credit, it looks like the thing in the anime. And I think the casting was nice, the paint job was relatively nice, and while it was in new condition to hang on a wall, it was more than sufficient to do it. And I also do want to point out here, I'll talk about cutting and the sword falling apart again later, but it cut fine. I cut tatami mats, I did water bottles and stuff like that, and the handle all held together throughout the course of that. And while I'm talking about how it broke and failed, I should note that it's nice that it gave me so many indications that, you know, it was on the way out. It wasn't exploding into a helicopter of death. Moving up from there, we have kind of the most uncomfortable part of this sword, this downturn guard. Now, in some versions of the anime, I've seen that this extends over the hand and acts as some sort of guard. And in this particular case, it's not. In some cases, it seems quite small. In other cases, it seems big and goes over the hand. The one that was reproduced, I think, is true to at least the way most of the drawings are done, but I'm not an expert. Anyway, the downturn guard, not great. If you're thrusting in with anything, it jams right into your hand. It's super uncomfortable, so not great for thrusting, despite this tip that would indicate that, or what was a nice pointy tip when it was new. The tip looks like it would be a fun thruster. Anyway, I would say that this is not particularly comfortable. It also, again, I'm going to take issue with the ad copy here. So this is kind of one piece, this this little section on here, this downturn guard that goes into the habaki area, or this collar area that goes into the scabbard and provides some retention like it does on a katana, and it's called a habaki, and it's this collar area. And this is all like one cast piece though, so it's not really a habaki, I don't think, or if it is, it's a different one than I'm familiar with. But either way, it's listed as a brass habaki in the ad copy, and it's not a brass habaki. This is made of the same kind of cast metal as the rest of the guard. I don't know that it's necessarily an upgrade to have a brass habaki, but your ad copy should be accurate. This is not made of brass. I can tell by where it's chipped. I can make out the kind of steel or alloy or whatever is used in the casting of these fittings. So not a brass habaki, kind of not really a habaki in the traditional sense. It's welded on or cast from the same piece as this downturn guard, and then the cross guard is set on underneath that. So anyway, it's a layered construction, and I think it does the job of looking like Pluck, but at the same time, it's not, I guess, as indicated online. The quillions and the guard and all that kind of stuff, incidentally, were actually pretty nice. So if I look underneath, all of the painting is pretty clean. There's not really an angle where I see paint is not applied. So even in the nooks and crannies, it's all done up pretty well. It all looked well when it was in one piece. And so in terms of general appearance, I thought it really looked nice. And I think most people are going to buy this because they like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. They want to have a Pluck sword, and they're probably not going to be as abusive with it as I was. And so if it's going to hang on your wall, maybe come out and occasionally chop a water bottle. I think it looks very handsome and looks like the piece in the anime. But be careful how much you swing, because the handle is prone to explosion. The other bit to note is that the tang section that is full is of reasonable size and reasonably well actually like ground. There's some amount of attention in the grind marks and whatnot on the tang itself. It's actually cleaner than a lot of tangs are, which gives me the impression that somebody spent a little time in terms of forming it up, which is good. I wish it was a full tang and extended all the way down. It perhaps would have held together a little bit better. But at least what I do see of the tang is nice. Unfortunately, it's just not full enough. Apart from that, just general crossguard thoughts. I didn't get to test it in usage as a crossguard before the blade kind of fell apart. But I get the feeling that the casting material here is probably going to break, given that the way it acted with the tang is that it cracked. And ideally, crossguards can take a strike from a sword. And so I would bet if I hit this with a sword, it would crack and probably not really be quite the right material to be used as a crossguard if you wanted to use it for the purpose of a crossguard. So looks the part, but I don't think quite acts the part, which in fairness, at $219, a fair number of swords out there that have crossguards on them really act the same way. So it's not that their Mini.Katana is not doing what everyone else does, but it would be nice to see, if you're selling a sword as a functional battle ready thing, that it's made out of something that's gonna take basically a strike from a sword and bend before it breaks. So moving up from there, I did want to note the scabbard component here. This has really nice furniture on it. I happen to like the overall appearance of the scabbard. The sticker component on there, I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it doesn't come off easily. The little leather wrapping also doesn't come off easily. You could stick this in a belt, but I'm not sure how it's supposed to be carried. I'm not necessarily carrying it in a belt. It could fit in an obi, like a Japanese style sword, but it doesn't have any kind of other mounting hardware that you would typically find on a European style sword. So I'm not sure how you're really supposed to secure it to your belt. But insofar as the scabbard is made, I really like the hilt furniture on it. The casting quality and all that kind of stuff is a little different for hilt furniture because it doesn't usually get whacked around. I thought actually the hilt furniture was generally pretty nice, adhered pretty well. It didn't come off, it didn't rattle. If I pulled on it, the adhesive held on, and all of that is really high marks for scabbards, because a lot of times $200 sword hilt furniture comes off if you pull on it, or is not necessarily as well made or cast as what I see on this sword. The paint as well looks like an Ishume style paint, which is common enough to see on katanas, and welcome here doesn't show fingerprints. Anyway, all in all, it seemed pretty well built, and the recessed area, or the slot in the mouth of the scabbard for the habaki area, fit well. So while it is not a habaki in at least the conventional way that I'm familiar with, and while it is not made of brass, it does function like a habaki and is tensioned correctly. And if I turn it upside down, it doesn't fall out, and with a little pull, it comes and deploys from the scabbard. So tensioning is really quite good, and not something I was actually expecting on a $200 kind of anime style sword. Anyway, the scabbard is nice. It's also nice you get a scabbard here. So oftentimes swords in the kind of $200 range don't always come with a scabbard. It's common enough on a katana, but when we go to kind of other obscure kinds of swords, getting a scabbard, particularly one that's reasonably well made like this, is not super common. So certainly welcome to see here. You might overlook the scabbard when you're buying the sword and just say, it comes with it, whatever. But it's actually really nicely made, and certainly worth something. All right, now I'm going to talk about the blade, the pointy stabby part. So the blade is reasonable. It's basically like a cartoon come to life. It has a very weird geometry, like a child's drawing of a European style sword. But in terms of its manufacture, was reasonably clean. The central ridge doesn't waver around a lot. The bevels on it are actually, reasonably nice. There's not a giant secondary bevel on it, and the tip comes straight out to a point. But I would note that in using it, the tip was soft and didn't penetrate particularly well, at least into the log material that I had. But the blade itself is a mono steel. It doesn't have any characteristics on it apart from the geometry, which is pretty robust. And I've taken measurements down below so you can see that it doesn't have a huge amount of profile or distal taper, and the tip geometry is like I said, just odd, in that it looks like a child's drawing and just not something that you typically see in European style swords. But this is obviously something of a diversion of that. Sword, though, reasonably well made. Like I said, for a $200 anime sword, having lines that are clean is kind of a surprise, and the blade is reasonably well shaped. And I happen to like the shape. Having a drawing come to life, it was actually more fun than I expected. This sword is not anything to me in particular. I don't know much about Jojo's Bizarre Adventure. I don't know anything, especially nothing prior to reviewing this sword. And I can still say that it was generally kind of a fun shape. And what's left of this sword has a reasonable tang on here. And I bet if I took this off, I would actually have kind of a neat looking spearhead to attach, or a different kind of sword blade that is uncommon and fun. So I would say that there is merit to the blade here. And the last thing I want to note on the blade is sharpness. And I'm happy to report that this one came reasonably sharp. Sharp enough to cut bottles, enough to do okay on tatami mats. Unfortunately, not enough to really pop pool noodles apart great. But I'm happy to say that it has an apexed edge on here that isn't like some grotesque secondary bevel, and anyone mediocrely competent at sharpening could probably get this to a point where it would really be a very effective cutter. I bet if I put a different hilt on it altogether and used what was left of the tang, the blade itself would, or could be, a very effective cutter. It has a nice profile and overall a reasonably nice edge. Now, unfortunately, the thing that lets me measure the edge angles of things is broken, so I can't tell you exactly what it is, but it's a reasonably consistent edge and overall relatively well profiled. But that's going to bring us to usage. So as I noted, it kind of popped pool noodles apart. It kind of chopped tatami, not as well as a Japanese katana that's a little bit more effective and designed to do tasks like that. But it did cut those things reasonably well, and like I said, I think it could do better if I put a keener edge on it. All right, now I'm going to talk about moving it around. And I first want to note here that I know I'm going into the weeds on basically an anime sword, and hemming and hawing about how it handles and all of that kind of stuff is maybe nonsense to you, but it is worth calling these things out, and at least in my mind, one, because it's my shtick on YouTube, but two, because it's sold as battle ready, and if you're out there maybe choosing between buying this sword or a more historic one, then this may be helpful. But to those of you that may think this is unfair, I do want to note I have a soft spot for it. I have a big Conan sword, and that's a movie for an older franchise, if you will, but also a terrible sword. It's super heavy and has a round handle and wants to rattle itself out of your hand, and basically has a number of disqualifiers that make it a terrible sword, but I still love it and think it's an awesome sword. And that's because it's from a movie franchise that inspired me as a kid and got me interested in swords. And if JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is like that for you, then I can't blame you for looking past some of the sword's shortcomings, because it's a sword that inspired you, and you know, there's relatively few available out there. So I have a soft spot for it, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that whatever I say doesn't mean you can't enjoy the sword, but you still have to acknowledge some of them are there, especially if you want to go out and use this sword for anything. So things dynamically that are not great about the sword. Well, it's heavy. It's nearly 4 pounds, and swords this size, well, swords that are 4 pounds should be about twice as large, frankly. So it's got a lot of weight in the hilt. It's heavier than it needs to be, and you definitely feel that in moving it around. I've taken some dimensions and measurements of the dynamics and whatnot, and if you know how to read those, then they're down below. But more or less, it's cumbersome in the hand. It's hard to get tip speed. It's hard to start. It's hard to stop. It's not particularly fun to move. You definitely feel it. At the same time, if this sword inspires you, like the Conan one does for me, it doesn't matter that it's too heavy. It's still really awesome. So, do know, though, as a sword, not particularly fun to move around. Also, the grip, you can index it, but the handle being a little slippery, it turns in your hand as well, so as I'm striking things, I find that it moves because it's slippery. I also really tend to hold onto it very tightly, and then I become fatigued quicker because, again, the handle slips around a little bit and rolls in my hand sometimes as I'm striking. At the same time, though, it held together and did most of the sword things that you would expect it to do in terms of bottle cutting, noodle cutting, tatami cutting. All of those things more or less went as well as you would hope they would. And so you absolutely could do them without too much discomfort. You only really have to look out for this downswept guard here, because if you choke up on the cross guard, which I am prone to do, you will not be happy for it. So you have to give a little bit of room to the crossguard area, because it wants to come back and poke you. And also, if you're doing anything with a thrust, particularly if the thrust is into a hard wood object, then those things are also going to gouge you a little bit. So a little heavy, a little cumbersome to move around, rolls around a little bit, wants to chew on you somewhat, but those are the main complaints that I'd have about moving it around. The other bit to note about the grip, though, is that it's prone to explosion. So like I said, when I went to go do dumb stuff, I struck into logs, the pommel came off, and it got to a point where the pommel would not go back on. Then the tang component, the threaded part of the tang came off, and then the more exposed, or the more full part of the tang burst through the side of the handle. So when it comes to hard use, it's definitely not well suited to it. And when I think of battle ready, when I think of a sword sold as battle ready or said, you know, suitable for kind of that kind of aggressive contact, I don't think of water bottles. I think of hitting shields, of missing targets and hitting the ground and needing to withstand the rigors of battle. Now, swords also broke in battle, but I would say that the handle exploding and the pommel coming off and the things that I'm experiencing here are not necessarily great. The blade held up though, and the only complaint that I'd have would be that the tip appears to be a little bit on the soft side. This doesn't look like it was heat treated as thoroughly as it probably should be. Typically the tip would crack off or roll, but thrusting it into wood and having it have this issue is indicative of a tip that's softer than it should be. And I don't know why that's the case, but normally a tip, when I thrust it into like a tree or something like that, it might roll, it might bend if I kind of flop it over, but it doesn't usually kind of just fish hook on me. So maybe a little bit on the soft side, which is probably a good thing for an anime sword that's predominantly not going to be used in a war. Anyway, that is all the information that I can give you about the sword, about moving it around, about using it, and about bringing it to failure and the various failures that I experienced. And so hopefully at this point you have some idea of what to expect and if it's worth your money or not. But it's also time I answer that question myself. Do I personally think it's worth the $219? So the short answer is yes, but that is because there are not a lot of Pluck swords available out there, at least not that I'm finding, and maybe I'm just not looking in the right places. But if you want a sword to hang on your wall, you want it to look the part, you want it to more or less be able to come out and cut some, you know, bottles in the backyard, maybe a tatami mat or play Fruit Ninja or something like that, then I think this is going to do the job. And while it was in new shape, I thought the experience was pretty nice. It came in a nice box, the shipping was overall good, it looked the part, and the painting was overall good. And if it was just kind of sitting on display, I think it would absolutely be fine. And in terms of those activities, it seemed to hold up reasonably well. And some of the other things that I might draw complaints to, like the being able to pull the pommel off to tighten things up, some of those things might actually be helpful if that's all you're going to do with a sword. But if you're not a person that's looking for more of a display that you can use sometimes, and you're looking for something that is a really true and functional sword, then I think this misses the mark on a few levels. If this were not an anime sword, I would kind of change my tune quite a bit, and this would be quite a bit more negative a review. This is not a full tang. The pommel construction being pressure fit or friction fit isn't sufficient to have the moniker of battle ready. This construction where the tang can burst through, not an ideal scenario. So there's more that needs to be done if it wants to be called battle ready in my mind, because to me battle ready is not cutting water bottles in the backyard. I'm thinking that you would hit shields and have missed strikes and hit harder things that you weren't aiming at, and the sword would need to be robust enough to take on some of those, or at least survive some of those activities. Well, it might need maintenance at the end of it, but it needs to not explode in my hand in order to survive that kind of battle. So if you're looking for something that's going to do that, then this does not do that. But I don't think that $219 for what you're getting is a ripoff. I do think that Mini.Katana needs to update their ad copy though, because there's just a couple things that are spotted here. You know, tang not being full, but listed as full tang. The habaki saying brass. It's not, and so I think some updates there need to be made, but I don't think that I don't think what is being asked is obscene for what you're getting. Given that this is kind of an obscure anime sword, there's probably relatively few of them made. I think the fact that you have something functional at all is kind of impressive. And as a side note, because I have what's left, this actually isn't too bad a blade. So if I take these parts off, like, I think this would actually kind of make a neat looking spear or some sort of pole arm type thing. So anyway, I think that the blade, some of the components in here are actually quite nice, and I'm actually surprised by for $219. Anyway, hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully it's been helpful. That's really all I've got for you though. So I do want to offer again a special thanks to Mini.Katana for sending this my way for review. I hope it was helpful in helping you decide if it's worth your money or not. And that's all I got. Cheers, and thanks for watching.